And it is tied to gender ideology, in fact, because if nothing's real, if you should reject tradition, your family, these are what the left calls the systems of oppression. If you reject those, then you're just sort of making up your own life. So I'm going to be this, I'm not going to be that.
Why is nihilism in vogue, and what's the antidote? Don't look so surprised.
Whoever it is, he's not reading like an agent.
Surprised to see me?
The nihilists aren't out there shouldering bolt-action rifles from some rooftop. They're here. They're you. They're us. Still confused? Well, maybe here's a nihilist you might recognize, perhaps even like. And even portraying a nihilist consumed and destroyed this actor portraying him. And besides the Joker, what else in the movies is nihilistic? Well, this. No Country for Old Men. And just think about the title of that movie and the young person that is involved here who is raging against what he perceives as some sort of persecution. Paranoid, perhaps, paranoid delusion as well. But, we live in a fragmented reality, so allow me a moment to make some connections. You already know all this, you've simply been too distracted to really see it. So here it is. Actually, when there is an assassination like that of Charlie Kirk, it's not sufficient that we refer to it as wrong or evil. Of course it is. The real question is, what is driving this darkness, this discontent, this devaluing of life, liberty, and humanity? What's driving it?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't breathe. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head,
I want you to remember that all of this is basically happening in the context of a war in Ukraine that has been allowed to continue. It's basically a modern war that is happening under our watch while we go on with our merry lives. It's a catastrophe taking place during our generation. Ukraine could be any other smaller country in the world, a place with schools, hospitals, offices, government buildings, residential buildings. All are fair game apparently for missiles, bombs, and bullets. We saw recently one Ukrainian attempting to dodge all of that carnage, only to die a horrible and tragic death in safe as houses Charlotte, North Carolina. And I know how safe North Carolina is because I've been there. But here's what I mean, and I'm quoting from an article from Opinio Juris, Devalued Humanity, the Status of Human Life in Times of Nihilistic War, written by Elke Schwartz. And Schwartz writes, how is this allowed to happen in an era in which technological innovation, progress, and ubiquitous connectivity are supposed to have lifted our collective human consciousness? How is the currency of humanity evidently worth so little? In his letter to Klaus Eichmann, son of Adolf Eichmann, the philosopher Gunther Anders asked the question, what has made the monsters possible? Do you want to know what the answer is? Well, before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis, which I acknowledge is very different, it's very cerebral compared to what I normally do, but this is kind of the sort of thing I want to be talking about. If you're finding that worthwhile, meaningful, interesting, please do hit the thanks button. Thank you, and let's get started. So, where were we? How is this allowed to happen? Do you want to know what the answer is? When we say monstrous, we can say what happened to Charlie Kirk or Irina Zarutska. We can say that was monstrous. But what about what is happening to tens of thousands of Charlies and Irinas in the Ukraine right now, and in Gaza until recently? Isn't that monstrous? If you're already starting to feel reservations, that's your nihilism kicking in. Back to the article, for Anders, the technological artifacts that we have produced and that now constitute the majority of our world, which we have prioritized and elevated to the highest status of goods, have in turn made it impossible to comprehend the world in which we live. They have produced outcomes that are without measure, without compare, without comprehension. And I must say, if there's something about Tyler Robinson that I think is quite interesting is it's that he seems a little incoherent in terms of his own trying to express himself, in terms of what he wrote on these rounds, and just the whole way he is responding to his world. There's a certain incoherence that is associated with it. And what happens when that happens, when there's this incoherence? Well, it has fatal consequences. A world that has become too big, too incomprehensible, gives rise to a chasm between production and imagination. Writing against the context of nuclear weapons, he notes that the modern human can produce all kinds of things, but we are no longer able to either measure up to all our products or imagine the consequences of that which we produce. When we politicize the death of someone we don't know, like Irina Zarutska, as if she's someone we do know, like Charlie Kirk, I think two things are happening. Firstly, we are wanting to borrow strength, claim greater stakes of agency, scrape the bottom of the barrel for every iota of power that we can. What is happening, we're trying to make a mountain of grievance, which then by implication earns us the right to a certain reaction, a certain justified response. Secondly, we have already reduced a living, breathing person, someone with a whole life and world beyond our ken, to a mere pawn in our schema, whatever it is. What this does is it dehumanizes the person on whose behalf we are supposedly acting. So what is the right response, I mean socially, morally, legally, to monsters and monstrousness in our midst, if not politicizing our reality? It's a good question. Let's start by looking at maladaptive responses, which is nihilism. Number one, the maladaptive response. Ever heard of The Lord of the Flies? If you don't know the story, here it is distilled down to an easy-to-read cartoon. And you notice in this little community, someone is elected leader, someone doesn't like it and becomes aggressive, and then things unravel. And this is just a bunch of boys on an island. But think of that as a kind of analogy to a bigger picture. Now, on second thoughts, words might be a little more helpful to elucidate the more subtle elements of the plot. In William Golding's Lord of the Flies, a group of British schoolboys crash land on a deserted island and they attempt to govern themselves. And in the first opening scenes of this movie, you literally see these kids in what appear to be military uniforms. And this is what makes it, the unraveling, so disheartening and so surprising, is how they go from these military uniforms to kind of like barbarians, to savages. Initially, they elect Ralph as their leader and they try to maintain order and build a signal fire for rescue, but this quickly breaks down. The boys descend into savagery under the leadership of the power-hungry Jack. Now, in summary, it's about a group of boys let loose on an island and their inexorable, inevitable, and predictable descent into savagery. And so, once again, we are confronted with the question, what is the root of this monstrousness within us? Is it nihilism? Well, Lord of the Flies is often described as nihilistic because it presents a dark, pessimistic view of human nature, suggesting inherent savagery and a belief that there are no intrinsic moral principles. It's this idea that there's an innate human darkness in all of us. But I don't think it's as simple as that. And perhaps if you do, perhaps if you see it as nihilism, it says more about you than the story itself. I don't think it's about evil either, but somehow both of these concepts hold hands in the sense that both nihilism and evil are accessories in human beings devaluing other human beings. Evil, by the way, is a vague concept. I prefer the word savagery when talking about evil or violence. What many don't realize, and we see it in true crime all the time, is that when we dehumanize others, even the indefensible, even criminals and murderers, we end up dehumanizing ourselves. There seems to be this idea that when you look into the darkness for long enough, that darkness consumes you. And this is what makes the character Batman so remarkable, is his incorruptibility in the face of the environment in which he operates. Well, are we able to achieve the same level of incorruptibility? When we want murderers put to death, we become the murderers that are apparently so vile and intolerable to us. And I think the real issue we're dealing with here is, how do we hold on to civilization? How do we remain civilized when you have these monsters among us? In Lord of the Flies, the pig specifically symbolizes the beast, which represents inherent evil and savagery within human nature, along with the loss of innocence and the breakdown of civilization. As the boy society deteriorates, the pig's head becomes the Lord of the Flies, a focal point for the boy's descent into fear, violence, and chaos. And doesn't it feel to some extent like this is happening to our world, to our society? I feel like we are experiencing that loss of innocence right now, don't you? I'm talking about the loss of innocence that previous generations felt during apocalypses like the First World War and the Second World War, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Some of the very last carriers of memory of the Second World War are dying right now, which means we are just about ready to have to learn all those lessons about devaluing human life all over again. As I say, when you devalue someone else, they, them, other, you end up shooting yourself in the foot. And then what happens? You simply find yourself in a contest where whoever shoots first wins. Except that in a contest like that, where everyone is doing that, nobody wins. The whole world loses. In her excellent article, Devalued Humanity, the Status of Human Life in Times of Nihilistic War, penned more than a year ago, Alka Schwartz, senior lecturer in political theory at Queen Mary University, London, she suggests an environment where we can no longer feel adequately connected to reality, and where we have that, it means we don't know how to. We don't know how to connect to reality. We don't know how to feel responsible for that reality. She writes, such an environment where the world has become too big to understand privileges process over meaning and ultimately leads to the failure of being able to adequately feel, and in particular feel responsible. This differential between production and imagination, paired with a technological condition in which everything is drawn into the wake of computational machine logics, produces not merely the disappearance of the human as human, but a devaluation of humanity. At the time, Professor Schwartz was deconstructing the mass psychology behind the war in Gaza, and that was a year ago. But then things got infinitely worse since she wrote that article. This image was used in the article for illustrative purposes, but the scale of destruction now is gargantuan. If you're struggling to make sense of the size of the carnage or to feel one way or another about it, you can always apply a scale that you can make sense of. Imagine one man with a gun, one bullet, and an innocent victim being unexpectedly shot in the neck and killed in broad daylight and for no apparent reason. Or imagine a young woman sitting, looking at her phone and suddenly being attacked from behind, only to die on the floor in a pool of blood. If you're not sure about the scale of destruction of a city, think about the scale of the destruction of a single dwelling, of a single house, lying derelict on some sort of landscape, or some boat that is floating, empty, no longer going anywhere, no longer functional. These hollow apparitions are a kind of symbol of human beings today. Now extrapolate those deaths and the ruin of a single thing on a scale of 10,000 or 100,000 or 500,000. As soon as the numbers become so large, we can't seem to muster any way to think about it. And yet the constant raising of residential buildings, like a very distant rumble of thunder on a late autumn afternoon, perhaps while you are lounging at a pool or playing tennis or barbecuing, it sort of does register that something is on the horizon and has been there for some time. And as it gets later and the light diminishes, the storm seems to intensify. It's not going away. It's coming closer. Yes, it is. And that's why we have this growing anxiety. That's why some of us have trouble sleeping, because on a certain level we can sense not only what is coming, but what is already happening, and it's spreading. You may not know what to think of photos of an entire city reduced to rubble, unless and until it's your city, your neighborhood, and your house. You may not know what you think about lives that are in danger, threatened at the very quick, until it's your life. Then I'm not so sure it's so difficult to come up with feelings or to figure out who is responsible. And that then brings us to the right response to the situation, also known as the adaptive response. And we'll be dealing with that in the next episode, essentially part 2 to this, as I say, admittedly cerebral analysis. It is something different if it's something you appreciate going into this really deep area, but I think an important area. Please let me know in the comments. It is quite a serious subject, but also an important one, and one that we need to discuss. Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that for now. Look out for part 2 in this little mini-series. Take care of yourself and those close to you, and I'll see you guys next time.